Hello, and welcome to Philosophy Fools, a bi-weekly podcast where a young father and old bachelor talk about life, philosophy, and staying curious. After we catch up on what's been stoking our curiosity since our last podcast, Josh and Uncle Greg do an exit survey on Seneca's On the Shortness of Life. We'll tell you if it's worth your time and count down our top 5 personal reactions. Finally, we'll wrap up with Josh's Dad Corner and Uncle Greg's Question of the Week. Hope that sounds good, because that's what we're doing.
Good morning, Uncle Greg. How's it going?
Good morning, Josh. How are you doing? I'm feeling great.
I am feeling great. It's a Sunday morning. I just got a little exercise in, and I'm ready to have a fun conversation about philosophy.
Sounds good. So we're picking up from last week. We had our Secret Origins issue. And today we're doing our first discussion of a piece of philosophy. So we're going to be talking a little bit about our first reactions to Seneca's On the Shortness of Life. But before we do that, let's do a quick catch up on what's been going on this past week. Anything sort of trigger your curiosity?
Yeah, well, things are always triggering my curiosity, but I'll go over some of the things that for me are most important. So I talked a little bit last week about how I love golf and how that we both are into fitness. And so this my fitness journey, I'll probably talk about this almost every week, but so that this was a good year for me because after COVID, obviously I gained a little weight, and so I've been experimenting on myself about fitness, and the thing that I got curious about is that well, I try to do fitness a little bit different, or I have been recently compared to in the past, and so I've lost 35 pounds since January 1st, and I've barely been doing any real workouts. So the big thing here is that you don't have to go out and do an hour workout or work really hard on your fitness in order to lose weight or even gain aesthetics. And I think it's just something that is so popular in the fitness world, is that you have to work really hard to get things done. And as long as you focus on simple things, then you can really make some changes in your body. And so I haven't done maybe more than 2 workouts in the past 8 months that are actual 1-hour workouts. And I was able to do this. And the main reason I'm saying that is just, think differently. Like, you don't always have to do what everyone is saying, and you can still accomplish your goals.
Now, just in general, I mean, but obviously you changed something from the time that you gained the weight in COVID. What activity change did you take that isn't working out for an hour?
So when I say not working out, I mean I do certainly do fitness things. Yeah. So I do 10 minutes of resistance training every day. So not a workout, but I will do some push-ups, or if I have a machine, like say at work, I could do some rows on the machine, but very simple and but consistent. And so I have to do it every single day, and I really have noticeable muscle gains on my back, which was super surprising for doing such a bare minimum workout, like literally only two exercises a day, maybe.
Yeah.
And then the main thing is focusing on not overeating. And I think, and I mean, obviously that's like a simple thing that everyone says, but if you actually make that your number one priority, instead of going to run a mile every day or going to the gym every day, I think that made the biggest impact for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. It's funny you should even bring that up, because I talked to a friend of mine, and again, I'm 59, so I'm always reminded of the huge difference between being 34 and being 59, and that the rules remain kind of constant because you're absolutely right. If you lower your caloric intake and increase your activity, irrespective of by how much, it's going to help. The funny thing is that when you're younger, and I know this from personal experience, that you get much more benefit for a longer period of time. Whereas, as I've noticed as I've gotten older, because it seems to, what I mean by that is that it seems to jack up your metabolism, and that it'll actually sort of be something that lasts for 2 or 3 weeks. And what I've noticed is that I've gotten older is that there's like no continuous benefit. It's like you have to, the older I get, the more I have to exercise, or that consistency of exercise, or the lowering of the calories to get the kind of benefit that I may have gotten 10 years earlier, or 20, and clearly 20 years earlier. So it's just an interesting journey that we all take with our bodies, because it is,
Exactly.
it's slowing down.
Exactly. And that's a good thing. It's always changing, right? So
Absolutely.
your body's always changing, your mind's always changing. So you can't do the same thing in fitness, and you can't think the same every day. So I think that's just a really good model for everything in life, just comparing it to fitness.
100%. Yeah, you really just got to pay attention, because things are changing, and you just sometimes it's almost too late before you notice that the like, say, your energy level is sort of dropped a little bit. But it is, but I think it's super important that we all, as people, continuously look at things like, you're absolutely right, things like thinking, things like your exercise, things like your work. It's the kind of thing that something could be very interesting, and then like years later it becomes very boring, and that you don't really notice over that time, and that you really do need to continuously be thinking about, hey, why is it that I do work, and why is it that I used to like it and I don't like it now?
Very true. Very true.
And
So
actually,
now for you, did you have any?
yeah, oh, it's funny. I made my own segue there, which is that was this past Sunday was the official, like, for me, I made an official 2 year period of time where I was going to be on sabbatical, which just essentially means that I was paying myself to live and not working for somebody else. And with the coming of last Sunday, that was the end of that 2 year period. So I had to start thinking about going back to work, and this idea of putting together a job search. And it turned out that I posted something on social media last week that just indicated that time had come, and I was no longer on sabbatical, and I was now like formally in a posture of looking for a new position. And it turned out that my old position has an opening, and that they'd like to explore the idea of me coming back on board. So for me, the thing that I found very curious was how that affected me internally, which is there's nothing real about my sabbaticals. I just make statements. I'm like saying, okay, this is going to last for 24 months. But as soon as I make that statement, it becomes very real for me. And the exact same thing is true when I say it's going to be over, is that the sheer fact that I said, okay, well, the sabbatical's over, I felt a tremendous change in my internal state, where I became something who, instead of being very focused on what I was going to do for myself that day, I became very focused on what I was going to do to look for a new position. So it's just funny. That our brains sort of do what we tell them to do.
Yeah, I mean, do you get, so it must be nice to be able to have sabbaticals like for 2 years or whatever, and I guess that would be a great goal. Are you getting nervous to have to go back to work, or is it just since you have everything planned and you have your value hierarchies in place and everything, that this is just something that's going to happen, and the emotions and everything around it really are pretty minimalized because you have everything planned?
It's that's a really good question, because it's one of two things. If it turns out that I'm not in a position to return to my old position, then the job search becomes a very different thing. If I am successful in transitioning, because I would like to go back and work with my old team, and I liked the customer, so all of those things would be very pleasant for me. The difference is that it would very much be like I was on vacation for 2 years, because I know the people, I know what's going on. So the first day that I sat down, it would be just be going to work. However, if that does not work out, and I have to go through a process of starting to work for a new company with a new team and a new customer, that all of that begins, it's not even so much anxiety, but it is kind of exciting to sort of manage all of those things. but it's really different because it'll be a good, if I'm lucky enough for somebody to hire me, that would be almost 2 to 3 months of getting to know everything, because you get to know the new systems of your customer, meaning the technology systems. You get to learn their business processes. You get to learn the personalities. So there's all kinds of new learning that's attached to finding a new role, and that is and that can cause a combination of either anxiety or excitement, and they're kind of the same thing.
Yeah, and defining those is awesome. I really like the first 3 months of any new position that I'm going into. It's always in my experience, that's about half as yours, has always been the most fun of any time of my job is the first 3 months, because you get to learn, even if it's similar to your old job, you get to learn all the new processes and new experiences and how it's done. Everything's a little bit different. Plus, you get to meet a new team, and it's always fun to meet new people and how they work and how they interact. So I'm glad that you have clarity. And if you do end up at your old position, I'm glad that that seems like a very good environment for you.
Yeah, should be good. But and just something you just said really triggered something in my brain, which is it's being fully engaged, and that's that feeling of that first 3 months, is that you really start to, you notice the new doors and the new exits in the building. You notice where's the bathroom? I need to be able to get to the bathroom, and all these things sort of add to a certain energy that as we move forward, we really are just, we have a bad habit of just thinking that everything, once we know it, we know it. It's kind of like driving a car. You know, when you're a kid and you're starting to learn how to drive a car, you're like, everything's like interesting. Like, well, it's the gear shift. This is how my foot feels on the pedal. Oh, am I going to crash into a tree? And now it's like you'd be hard pressed to remember the drive you just took if somebody came up and shoved a microphone in your face and said, well, what exactly just happened over the last 20 minutes? You'd be like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting having such young kids. That's all they see almost every day is new, something new. And so it's I try and look at it from that lens and try and look at life from that lens a lot, because they see something that I see every single day. They're like, how do I open this gate on my fence, or something really simple like that, where
Yeah.
we wouldn't even think about it. And they go up to it and they're like, ooh, what is this? And like, what does this latch do? Something that I've done for 35 years, literally.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting way to look at things for sure.
Yeah, I think we absolutely disrespect how amazing our abilities are, and so that's it. And but there's also very little we can do about it except for just artificially try and remind ourselves of it, because that's part of being a good animal, is that once you learn something, you've learned it. You don't have to pay attention to it anymore.
Exactly. Just be mindful.
Right
Is
on,
there
brother.
anything else get you curious over the past couple weeks?
Not anything that's jumping out at me. I mean, you and I and the rest of the family had a chance to get together yesterday, and got to catch up with your brother, who I haven't seen for a good year and a half or so. So it was great to see him. And but I understand you guys were out playing golf on
Yeah, so we played golf twice this week, which was a lot of fun. We played on Thursday and Friday, and one thing that was kind of curious, that kind of struck my curiosity while we were playing was competition. So right now, yeah, so competition is something that was a big part of my life when I was young, and right now is there's really no competition in my life at all.
uh-huh.
And so it was pretty interesting, because my brother and I were always competitive growing up, and now as a father, I really try and encourage my kid. My whole life is about encouragement
Uh-huh.
and making and trying to, if my daughter misses the swing on the golf club, which happens all the time, I just try and encourage her, and there's no jabbing or anything like that to each other.
Yeah.
And so when I was playing with my brother and my father and my wife, we, which is a completely normal thing, we were, talking trash or bantering to each other about bad shots, and which is a lot of fun and a completely normal thing. What got me curious though is what is better? Is encouragement better, or is poking fun at each other in a fun way to make the environment more enjoyable, or like what is better for the human? And so that was just a question I had to myself. Do you have any initial reactions to that?
I do, and I think it has everything to do with the nature of the person, which is, we as people look for hard and fast rules for, like, how do I teach somebody to do this? And one of the things I've noticed over time is that some people respond really well to that kind of jabbing, like, in their psychology is such that it sort of triggers something fun for them. And that's really I think the issue of competition is it fun or is it pathological? And you have to sort of watch it, because if you see an adult playing softball, and you get this notion of, somebody who's like really wants to win, and that's where you get a lot of energy, like, hey man, and you will talk trash and it's kind of fun. But then you see it inch over into an entirely different sort of universe where the person it's like they're trying out for the Yankees, and they don't have the presence of mind to realize that they're just an old person on a softball field, that their level of competition is extraordinarily out of whack with the actual challenge at hand. And that's when it becomes kind of sick. So to your point, though, is that with young kids, a lot of them will just give up if you don't encourage them. You'll just sit there and go like, that was pretty stupid that you missed the ball. And then they just go like, forget it. I'm never doing it again. And so
It's
and
also
so
like teaching them, because you have to teach them a little bit when they're young too, because they're going to run into it at school or on the playground or something like that. They're going to run into that banter. So it's like you want to encourage them when they're young, and then you also want to give them a little bit of that playful banter, just to kind of like get their expectations to the right point, so that when they get out to the playground and other kids are jabbing at them in a fun way, if they know how to do that at that age, then they're used to it. So I thought that was, I don't know, I really started thinking about it, and I do agree with you where it's definitely like the person and the setting that you're in, that you have to kind of determine if you're gonna be given that banter
Mhm.
or if you're gonna be giving encouragement. Because I go to the golf course with the mindset of, I'm not a pro. I'm there to enjoy the sun. I'm there to enjoy my brother and my father and my wife, and I'm not there to win, you know. But for me also, the banter, like maybe just because I was a competitor when I was young,
uh,
gives me like a little edge. Like
it,
I don't know what it does to me chemically, but it like gets my mind to a place where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna win.
well, yeah, and what is, I think what it does is it clearly focuses your brain on what's actually going on, which is, well, because there's a huge difference between really wanting to win a game and just sort of wanting to win a game, and it doesn't matter at all. We aren't even going to keep score. We're just going to keep playing. Like, those are utterly different success outcome. And I was just thinking about this because it just popped into my head, was like, if you're teaching your child to hit a golf ball, going back to your idea of encouragement versus, like, like getting cutthroat, is that there is this big difference between teaching a fundamental, which is how do you stroke the golf ball, how do you hit the golf ball. That is something that really is precedes competition. It is not, you might have a little internal competition, like, I really want to hit this ball, but when it comes down to you as a teacher, you're just trying to get them used to the fact that there's certain things they have to do just to make contact with the ball on a regular and persistent basis. And that really is very different from, like, hey, because if you start just ridiculing somebody and they're trying to play t-ball and they can't hit the ball, it's there's just no upside to that kind of negative reinforcement, I don't think. But not being a parent, I'm not really sure. But I really do. I think I'm really curious to see how this is going to work with you over time, because you'll be experiencing this with your daughter, and then you'll also be experiencing this with your son in the near future. And so it'll be fun to see, like, what lessons you learn, or if you just turn into one of those horrible like tennis parents who just change your child to the tennis court.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll see over time what happens.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, it sounds like we've had a pretty decent break in the last week or so. But the one thing that we did do is we read Seneca's On the Shortness of Life, and I think what we'll do is just take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll do our instant reactions to reading that piece of text. Sound good?
Sounds good. We'll be right back. All right, Uncle Greg, we are back to discuss our instant reactions to On the Shortness of Life. So I know you've listened to it or actually read it quite a few times. So what do you think about it?
I actually believe it to be probably my favorite piece of philosophy text. But before we get into our opinions and our reactions to it, what I definitely want us to do is just sort of do a quick overview of what we read and what it actually is. And the text is called On the Shortness of Life, or Life is Long If You Know How to Live It, by the Roman philosopher Seneca. He wrote it in 49 AD, and I think it's just really important to remember just how long ago this was written, because it does give us a chance to sort of see that that's nearly 2,000 years ago, and it's something that is it's important to keep in mind that if something was written 2,000 years ago and it still makes a lot of sense, there's probably something really good inside of it. When he part of the text of what he was writing was just trying to bring up a lot of different Stoic principles that are things like the nature of time, that, and also that people waste a lot of time, and they waste it on meaningless pursuits. Also, in general, time is best used by the living in the present moment in the pursuit of the intentional, purposeful life. So it takes the form of a letter to, I believe it was his father-in-law, but I think there's some disagreement about that specific thing. But again, we are not academics. We just read this book. We thought it was pretty cool, so we wanted to talk about it. So bottom line is, you've got a very short piece of work, which I believe in my book is about 24 pages long, and I think you told me it was about an hour and a half listening to it.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, and so that's kind of investment that a listener would take to if they wanted to read it. And you and I obviously had a real positive reaction to it, but I did want to get into this idea of, like, do you think it's worth the read? Is it worth the time it takes to read it?
Well, for myself, if I can answer this, absolutely. So I have read this, where I've listened to this probably 20 times in the past couple years or so, since you introduced this to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do think that it is worth it, because it lays out kind of a foundation of philosophy, and not just philosophy, but life in general, and how to use your time in life properly. I think that myself, I benefited from it, and I think other people can benefit from it too, because it just gives you that foundation. I mean, if you're just going through life and don't have a path or anything like that, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is pretty common. It was common for it definitely was my story, and I think it's common in a lot of people. And so it just gives you, it makes you think about life from the end. And I think that really anybody, especially younger people, but really anybody can get anything out of it who wants to live a little bit more examined or intentional life.
Okay.
And I think so. So I definitely think it was worth it for me. And I know you've read it quite a few times. Do you think who else can benefit from it, do you think?
I this is one of the few pieces of sort of classic philosophy that I've read that I genuinely believe that anyone who reads it would benefit from it. And what I mean by that is that there isn't really it doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't really matter what your age is. And in fact, it's one of the few pieces that I've read over time where it's truly worth repeating. Like if you got yourself onto a regular schedule of listening to On the Shortness of Life every 5 years, that it would be a huge benefit to you, because it's a good centering activity. It really makes you think about what's important in life. And it also, what I really mean by the idea of catching up with it every 5 years or so, is that it'll show you how much you sort of lose the thread of the things that you think are important in life. And this very short read is something that crystallizes your thinking about life at that moment in time.
I would say that like for me, I like to use certain texts as my base or my foundation, right? So you said every 5 years. I mean,
Yep.
I like to read this, once every 6 months, and for me, it's just a quick listen on the way to work, and so then it kind of grounds me back into the base of my philosophy. I have a couple other books that are similar to that I kind of keep in rotation and that I use, and I think it's just good to reread this book, and I think that should be something that everyone puts on their shelf, that they can go back to listen to, or to read, whatever your preferred media is.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like we're both very enthusiastic thumbs up on folks, like anybody reading this text.
Read it. That's awesome.
That's great. And I think that that is the top of our exit survey, which is really just at the highest level. What is it, and what do we think? Do we think people should listen to it and or read it, and also what would they get out of it? So now that we've kind of gone through our top level on this, I thought it'd be kind of fun if we took a real high level, like a 10,000-foot view of our reactions to reading the text. And so I thought we could put together like a top 5 list of the things that hit us in the text, thinking, like, knowing that what we're going to do for our next episode is we're going to dive really deep into the specific ideas that are present in On the Shortness of Life. But this gives us a chance to just talk about our instant reactions, our emotional reactions to reading On the Shortness of Life, and hopefully give people a sense of the kind of value that they could get out of it. Does that sound like a good idea?
I think that is a great idea. I love the top 5.
Sweet. Okay.
So we will take a quick break and then come back to discuss our list of top 5 takeaways from On the Shortness of Life.
Okay, and we're back. We're here to talk about our top 5 takeaways from On the Shortness of Life. Josh, why don't you kick us off with your number 5?
All right, Uncle Greg. So number 5, takeaways. These are high level takeaways. So we'll start it off with an easy one here that I got out of it. Is just he talks about the value of just reading old philosophers, or any philosophers really, and the reason that was number 5 and important to me is because I went through a lot of my life not living an examined life or a purposeful life, and so, but I also was fairly aware of some of my downfalls and some of my strengths. So once I started to read philosophy and just try and figure myself out a little bit more, then putting the two together, like my thoughts from my teenage years and my 20s, and then putting that on top of philosophy, and the philosophy really started to make sense of my thoughts. So for me, I thought that was super important, and that's why I put that at number 5 on my list.
Now, do you think that there's a part of that that's just like a sense of, because this is something that eludes a lot of people, but the idea of, hey, other people think the same kind of thoughts I think, or other people have the same kind of questions I have, whereas you might have.
Yeah, I mean, it could certainly be that. I like kind of like a confirmation or of my thoughts because other people have had them. That certainly could be it. I also think that I just never wrote anything down and put it in front of me and really tried to make sense of my thoughts. So just hearing somebody else who has already thought about it, and who probably, like you just said, has the same thoughts as me, maybe.
Hmm.
But they were able to explain it and put it out there on paper, and figure it out. And that's something that, for me, maybe because I never wrote it down, or I never really sat there and thought about, hey, am I doing XYZ? Like, what's going on with this? But as soon as I read it and saw somebody else going through it, then yeah, it made a lot more sense. And so I definitely think that that could be a reason.
Yeah, because one thing I've noticed over my life is that I think people, particularly when we're younger, we really do think that what we're going through in life is completely unique, and nobody else would understand if we told people about it, or like there's that sense of isolation. And I think that as we grow older and look into things like on the Shortness of Life, for me was a really good example of, as I started to read it, and I think I did the first time I touched it was around when I was around 40, and it really struck me that, wow, this is really stuff that I know in the back of my head. I've been thinking about, but I've always thought it was just me who was concerned about this. And then boom, all of a sudden I've got this kind of, not just validation by the fact that some 2,000 years ago people were thinking the same thing, but also that sense of like there is a way to organize it and move forward. And so reading old philosophers, reading new philosophers, reading anybody who sets down a repeatable kind of step-by-step process for life gives you a chance to at least disagree. It gives you something you can say, like, I don't think that's the way it should be. And in disagreeing helps to clarify your own thoughts.
Yeah. What you just said about the isolation is pretty interesting, because really, when we grow up, we're from our parents. So we hang with our parents, and then usually there's only 10 or 20 people who are close to you in your life. So you don't really know, there's 7 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
So a lot of times your thoughts are, you can feel isolated. But the one thing now with the internet, it's easier to find other people who have your same opinions. I don't know if that's always a good
Right.
thing. But at least it gives us more options. And even though this text is 2,000 years old, there's a good chance that I wouldn't have read it if it wasn't an audiobook on YouTube. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the isolation is a real thing. That's a good point.
It is, and I think that's it's always a side benefit to reading anything where you really puts you in mind of the idea that we are kind of all the same, because that sense of isolation really, I think, drives us to thinking like the things we're thinking are crazy, and no one should think these things, or how come I'm the only one who knows the truth? Like there's all of these kinds of thoughts that when you start to get out there, interact with real people instead of online people, but also interact with text from the past, from philosophers, from just great writers. They really do put you in mind of the fact that we're all kind of part of the same boat. And it's funny because you really, again, I can't stress enough that when I first read on the Shortness of Life, how modern it felt to me as I read it. The only thing that seemed antiquated were the names that were being used, the fact that they were old Roman names, but all the ideas felt fresh, they felt real to me, and it was a great experience. And it was probably one of the first times since college that I actually exposed myself to old philosophers. So I do think that that's a really good takeaway. Your number five is a really good takeaway on this idea of always thinking that there's a lot of value in heading back to the source, heading back to old philosophers, old writers, the whole caboodle. So that brings me to my number five, which was when I really stepped back and thought about it, it's kind of similar to what I was just commenting, which is I think it's really important to have a conscious awareness of life as a thing, conscious awareness of what it is, and a conscious awareness of what it isn't, because it's very easy to just live life, to just sort of get born and go through life and have all these kinds of fears and struggles, and like I said, feel isolated, feel like you're the only one who's ever felt something, feel like there's no place to turn, that you're sort of trapped on in your inner self. And the part of what having a conscious awareness of life is sort of sitting back and saying, well, I guess it really isn't the culmination of all my dreams and fantasies, that life really is just what I make it. Life is what I choose it to be. And that life is a thing that you do. It's not a thing that happens to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, so what do you think? Now, how do you come to that, that conscious awareness? Like, because you can read a book and you can say, okay, I think I know what my life is about, or I think I know what my life isn't about. So, how do you actually get to that point where you have that awareness?
Well, I think the Stoics kind of lay out a good framework, which is control, which is, what do I control and what do I don't control? What is it? What's in my power to affect and what's outside of my power to affect? Because just that simple meditation really begins to show you life. It shows you the idea of, if I spend a lot of my time being anxious about the fact that my boss hates me, that's a thing that is outside of my full control. It's a thing I can try to influence, but it is by no means a thing that I can stop on my own. And part of life is learning that lesson of, oh, well, let me put my energies into the things that I can control. Like, how can I try and correct this? Because and that's sort of the idea. Like, so when I think about the idea of life, you get born and you die, and there's a period between those two things. And that I think that we can look at it, the more active we are during that period is the thing that we think of as life, because we also realize that if we go through a long period of time where we kind of are just adrift, that we know that we aren't really truly living. And so,
It's like I can get stuck in a job for 10 years
yeah,
and hate my job for 10 of those years, and
mm,
then not even think about it though. But all I think about is that job is terrible and I don't like it, and but that ruins my life, even though I could be just aware of what I really want and what I really don't want, and then make decisions and actions from that point.
and I think that when I say that the having a conscious awareness of life is, I heard something a long time ago, which always struck me, which is the idea that life is decision. The more decisions you make, the more alive you feel. And the fewer decisions you make, the more dead you feel. To the point that if you get all the way down to a sense of life where you feel like you can make no decisions, that you're sort of almost a living dead person. And this goes back to this idea of a conscious awareness of life, because if life is decision, that means that I should be looking for opportunities to make decisions.
Awesome. Awesome. I like that number five for sure.
Cool. So what's your number four?
Well, kind of along the same lines of work, is that, people just work because they've been told it's valuable. And they say, hey, listen, you need to go to college and you need to get a good job and you need to find a wife and you need to have kids, and that's it. And this kind of, it goes right along with your conscious awareness of life, because you can get stuck in a job just because the society or school, or however you want to frame this, has told you since day one that this is what you should do. Like, oh, you have a job in IT. That's a great job. You're doing well in life. But does any of that have anything to do with you or what you want out of life? And I think that's a question that this text really helped me pose, is like, is what is valuable, and is something like the American dream that on paper is what you're quote unquote supposed to do. I mean, is that really what you as an individual are supposed to do?
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to get lost in that, and that's something that I found from this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I find interesting about this point is this idea of when you frame the concept of the American dream, a lot of times, and let's just shorthand what we mean by that. So it's sort of like what you said, which is, you grow up in a nice family, you go to a nice school, you marry somebody, you get a job that turns into your career, you raise your family, you retire, you die. And that all of those things are good, but if you take the American dream as a blueprint for all you have to do, then it can feel very hollow. But at the same time, when you look at something like, you know, what is value, like when you're telling yourself, and I can't begin to tell you how much I've seen this in my personal life and in my professional life, where if I ask somebody who's complaining to me, they're coming up to me, oh, this job sucks, I hate life, and I go like, hey man, whoa, what is it that is important to you? Why do you work? And a lot of times they will laugh and say, well, it's just for money. And then I come around and it's like, well, why don't you rob banks? Like if the exclusive rationale is something as simple as money, then why don't you spend your whole life trying to find more and more effective ways to generate cash? Why are you settling for a job with a pension and with with a hierarchy to it that you try to work through? And it's because they've never really thought about it. They've never really put any mental effort into it, and they genuinely think the only thing they get out of work is money and health insurance.
And I mean, do you think it's just because most people just don't think? I mean, is that what we're kind of getting at here? Is that, we don't think and we need to read these books so that we can try and figure out how to think about these things every day?
I think there's a part of it to that, but more than anything, it may be something even simpler, like people don't think they have the right to think, or they don't have they don't have the power. They haven't been given permission to think outside, to be outside the box. And that it's I made this crack to a friend of mine years and years ago, and I can't believe how true this is, which is, if you go to a bar and you want to get a huge crowd around you, start talking about how bad your job is and how much your boss sucks. Because you will find a million people coming and go, yeah, man, my boss sucks too. And people will begin to talk about how horrible their lives are too. And you're being bound together by how terrible things are. But if you want to like clear a bar, just sit down and go like, you know what? Let me talk about my goals in life and the things I'm going to do to achieve them. And people just scatter to the winds because they want nothing to do with that kind of thinking. So it's a funny thing. But again, towards your number four, I just think it's really important. You really stumble upon something very, very important there, which is that sort of people are walking around like zombies. They just aren't. They aren't thinking. And that's something like, even reading one philosophy text can really change your trajectory.
I love it. So that was my number four. What about your number four?
Oh, my number four it's super simple, but it was something that when I first read On the Shortness of Life, I was like, going even just to the title of On the Shortness of Life, the idea that life is short. It's obvious. It's an obvious statement, but so rarely do we take it seriously. And it made me think about this idea of how valuable acknowledging the obvious is. And that it got me thinking again, life is short. People will say that all the time, and it's a cliche. And for whatever reason, we go, yeah, life is short. Let me tell you about how hard my life is, without truly engaging with that simple statement. And it made me think, just and when I say this, I mean, you're always going to encounter all these sort of obvious statements that people make, and it's really easy to just dismiss them. And what I mean is things like actions speak louder than words, and the grass is always greener on the other side. You can't judge a book by its cover. All of these things are amazingly true, and if you think about them, you will get a deeper and deeper insight into life, because these things don't survive as cliches without having some kind of true and powerful meaning.
Yeah, it's funny. You and I could talk about some of these things for a long time, right? Because we like to think like that. I heard an interview the other day from a teacher, and he was having a conversation. He's like, well, I teach first graders and then I teach 11th graders.
Right.
And so when he teaches a first graders, he can say something like, the grass is always greener on the other side. What does that mean? And everybody in the room will raise their hands and give an answer. Now, the first graders' answers might be hysterical and might be very obvious, but at least they're all thinking about, what does that actually mean?
Uh-huh.
And then he says he'll pose that same question to a room full of 11th graders, and not one hand will go up because sometimes something in school or whatever happened. He didn't get into this, but our minds go to, oh, well, that's just a cliche, like that doesn't mean anything, or love is blind, like what does that mean? Like that doesn't mean anything to me. That's just like a something that's made up.
Yeah.
So something weird happens that people start ignoring cliches and things like that, even though these are, things that they're philosophical themes that we can really think about and do a lot with if we put our minds to it.
Well, I think that people are kind of hardwired for novelty. They just like they want to disrespect the notion that any real knowledge exists outside of them. Like it's their exploration of life that's going to reveal the truth unto them. And again, like you had made a comment last week, and I concurred, which is, when you were 25, you thought we were super smart. And I'm telling you, I thought I was a stone genius when I was 23 years old. I was like, man, I can learn nothing. And and then life just smacked me over the head long enough that I really got to this place like, God, I don't know anything. And that sort of began my journey of trying to figure out what's going on. And it's just that idea of it's out there. If there's a thing that has been beaten into me over time, it's this idea that answers to questions tend to be simple. It's only the execution that's difficult. So if you are somebody who's addicted to a substance like opium, the simple, like the true answer to like how do I stop being addicted to opium is stop taking opium. The answer is there. Like whatever however you put it, there's a 1-for-1 correlation between the question and the answer. But the huge gap is the execution. It's all the things that it takes to make that happen. But I think that that's where we tend to get hung up, is in the complexity of the execution part, but forget how simple the answer parts are. And so like when I was having a conversation with a buddy the other day where I just made this comment that like, do you like to be happy? And he was like, well, yeah, of course I like to be happy. And I was like, well, I mean, do you like it enough for it to be a thing that you will commit yourself? Or is it something that happens, and when it happens, you're kind of happy that it happens, but that you live in a world where the notion of your personal happiness is out of your control? And that conversation really sort of kicked off the idea. But if you think about that, it's a simple question. Do you like being happy? And everybody will say, yeah. But then the question is, will they do what it takes to be happy?
I feel like that's always the question for anything. Like we all, it is easy to find the answer. Like if the answer's out there, but it's just that step to get there is always tough. And yeah, I don't know. It's like a combination of being aware and reading philosophy, and I think there's just a lot to it that gets you to that point. And that's something that I've noticed in philosophy is just like there is an answer that different philosophers give to things, or maybe they're just posing questions. But like, yeah, how do you fill that gap? That's always the tough thing, really, for me.
Yeah, and for me, just to finish off my number 4 was just this idea of there's just a lot of value in listening for the obvious, because sometimes that'll really trigger something in you. And my reaction to On the Shortness of Life, a lot of it was just to the title and saying, you know what, life is short and life is long if you know how to use it. So it's obvious, but at the same time, super important.
Absolutely. And so I think that leads me into my number 3, which is, so one thing that I learned from this text is that that I think I was just living for tomorrow. One thing Seneca says is that a lot of people live for leisure in retirement, but then they never have a holiday, throughout their life.
Uh-huh.
So they just work, 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 and thinking that there's going to be a time in their life that they're going to be able to. Well, this is a bad example for Seneca, but like hang out at the beach and
Hmm.
just spend time with the family all the time. And that's something that I think about a lot. Like do I need to enjoy my life more now is the question that I pose to myself, and I think the answer to that is 100% yes.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I've gotten out of it, and I've kind of been trying to design my life better so that I have leisure as a big part of my life now, because one thing that he says is that it's not guaranteed that you're even going to get to retirement age. So
Yeah.
why put off your leisure till tomorrow?
Yeah, 100%. And that's a really good example of having to manage this idea of, you may have a desire for something to happen in the future, but your ability to affect it is very different than your ability to affect what's happening right this second. And so I think that by having this idea of having a real value, because living for tomorrow is just, I think we just get ourselves stuck in that. And beyond that is also living in yesterday. That people like that idea of replaying what happened and like how they could have done it different and all that kind of stuff. And it's almost the same instinct as saying like, man, but tomorrow I'm going to really get up on time, and tomorrow I'm going to stand up for myself, and all of these types of things, because tomorrow and yesterday can just shift. They just float along, and it's almost like a secret room you can go into where you don't have to really confront the fact that you aren't doing anything right now.
And I think a lot of people, including myself in the past, they just don't realize it.
Yeah.
That they don't realize that they're living for for tomorrow that isn't guaranteed, and they don't realize that they're so excited that last week they hit their sales quota, but really that doesn't matter anymore, because it just starts over next time. But you live in that space where something might have happened a few weeks ago that either hurt your life or helped your life, and you just live there for a while. And it's I'm getting ahead of myself here, but my number 2 point will be awareness of being present, and we'll get into that.
Okay.
But just being those three things, balancing the future, the present, and the past, all, I mean, because you do need to focus on the past a little bit because you want to learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
You want to focus on the future a little bit
Yeah.
because, I mean, you need some kind of direction, you need some kind of goals, but you also need to focus on the present more, because the present will affect the future and the past. So it's an interesting balance for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it fits in with my number 3, which was the idea of managing paradox. When I read on the Shortness of Life, the thing that really just smacked me in the face was this idea of life is long if you know how to use it, and life is short if you don't. And so he was positing this universe of, hey, wow, you could live to be 80 and just on your deathbed be like, oh, I've wasted my life. This is just a terrible thing. It's a tragedy that I lived to be 80. And then you could also squeeze your life to its maximum potential, but die at 30, but have a moment of realization of, like, at that moment of death, of like, wow, I've really lived my life. There's really almost, I'm not happy to be dying, but wow, look at this. And so the notion of the calendar year, the calendar time, is extraordinarily separate from the living time. Kind of going back to what I said about making lots of decisions, that if you unfortunately pass away at 30, your perception of whether you had a short life or a long life is really going to be predicated on how well you lived that period of time. And the exact same thing is true for living to 80. And so when I talk about managing paradox, it's that notion that you have to live like you will not make it past tomorrow, and live like you're going to live till you're 100, and being able to manage the fact that those two things may seem to be in conflict, but that they really aren't. That basically you can, like, because an example being, if somebody who has a very simplistic view of life would be like, well, in order to live my life to the fullest every day, I have to climb mountains and jump out of aircraft every second of every day. That without really taking seriously the notion that might get old over time. And wait a second, now I'm 40 and I've developed no skills in life except for being an adrenaline junkie. And so it's about being able to say, and this actually this ties in with my number one, but I'm going to keep it secret for right now. But it's this idea of just realizing that you have to embrace the idea that you don't know when you're leaving. You don't know when the death is coming. So you need to live every day with meaning and value. And you have to accept the notion that you may die young, and you have to accept the notion that you may be very, very old when you die, or any point in between.
I like the quote that Seneca gives. It says, "It is not that we have so little time, but that we lose so much. The life we receive is not short, but we make it so. We are not ill provided, but we use what we have wastefully." I think that ties in with everything we just said pretty well.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so just be present, manage your paradox of the long life versus the short life, and really just trying to figure out, the past, the present, the future, and combining everything together. It's really not as complicated as we just made it, but I mean, as long as we realize that life is short, then I think that's a great number two and number three.
Well, it gets into this idea of there being no that the past and the future are fantasies. They are fictions that we manufacture. Because when we think about the future and when we think about the past, they're ghosts. They are 100% just constructions of our minds, because we're putting together things from the past to try and, like, because we're definitely going to make a memory that's either better or worse than what the reality was, because reality tends to be super boring. So we like to make our lives as interesting as possible. And when we think about the future, it's just a future ghost. It's like, it feels real to us in the moment because we're thinking so hard about the future. But when it comes down to brass tacks, the only thing that is real is the moment you're living in. So when and you had on your number two was awareness of being present, and that is, I think we're starting to realize that when we talk about philosophy, trying to segment things is hard because they're all part of this big soup of ideas. And but I think there's a lot of value in trying to create lists like this, our top 5 list. So is there now, but to your number 2, which is the awareness of being present, is there anything else you'd like to talk about with that, or have we covered it?
We've covered everything. I just want to hammer it down. This one final point is that along with being present, I mean, being really present in the moment. So, I mean, he doesn't, obviously Seneca doesn't talk about it, but in our day of age now, putting your phone down, I mean, I don't need to say that, but I think that's super important. I mean, anyone who has a phone in their hand is not being present at the
Right.
time, unless they're being present on their phone. Like if you're by yourself, then you're present on your phone. But if you're with other people and you keep on grabbing your phone and everything, you're not seeing everything as it is, and that's just a huge thing that I'm sure everyone talks about, not being on their phone and everything, but really doing it, I mean, it makes a huge difference in life. And that's one thing that I just wanted to hammer down a little bit more on being present, is just phones and TV and just everything that's out there right now makes it hard for us to be present, even harder than it was 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so this is just something that we have to think about and be aware of every day, because every day we're going to have roadblocks in front of us to try and get over, to be present. I mean, it's a hard thing to be present.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're absolutely right. Because you sort of have to take responsibility for you being in the present. but you don't really have to take responsibility for being in the past or in the future, and it's a funny thing. And you're right about devices, because there is you could, if you were engaged, if you and I are currently on a computer and we are using a social media tool like Zoom to speak to one another, but we're fully engaged in a conversation. So the tool isn't the thing that makes it kind of a waste of time. It's whether or not you're just zoning out when you're just sort of flipping mindlessly through Instagram. You're like, that's a cute dog. Ah, that's not, I'm not saying cute dogs are bad. I am saying that if your entire life is sort of drifting away, and the full extent of your involvement is that you saw a bunch of cool pictures, you probably won't think your life is that valuable.
But yeah, but we don't even realize it. I think that's the biggest thing, is that it's just, we're just doing it,
Yep.
and not even, no one thinks about being present, and including myself. So I mean, I just think, well, and now that it is something that I think about, taking the actionable steps of putting your phone away, or making sure the TV is off at certain times, and little things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just what I mean. Seneca's problems 2,000 years ago were a little bit different than ours, but I mean, it's a bigger fight for us now. And so I think this is, even though it's my number two, because my number one, which I'll keep secret right now too, just has everything that kind of goes into it. I think being present is something that I've gotten from this book, and other texts these days about being mindful and everything, that has made a huge impact on my life.
Mm-hmm. And that really feeds into my number two, which is having a relationship to death, like having a formal, conscious relationship to your own death and the death of others. Because in the Western civilization, we do so much to hide death. It's almost kind of sick that you really don't, like, the only time that you're presented with sort of images or notions of mortality is through fiction, where it's often glamorized, like the exciting death, or when you engage it on the news, and it's always somebody else's death, and it's abstracted in a certain way. But when you come to points in your life where you have to sit with somebody's corpse, and somebody's corpse that you love, it brings home these ideas of, hey, wait a second, this is going to happen to me. But it's not just going to happen to me. It's going to happen to everybody, and it's going to happen to everything. And so when I sit down and say, like, I am going to spend the next 3 hours of my life looking at funny cat videos, if I don't have a real relationship to the fact that, hey, wait a second, I could totally die while I'm watching these cat videos, and making a conscious decision of, like, well, then that's just the way it's going to be because I love cat videos. That's one thing. But if it kicks you into another mindset of, like, you know what, I always wanted to write this book, or my daughter wanted me to play with her outside, or whatever it is that is a choice in the moment. If you aren't thinking seriously about the fact that your life is a finite thing, it's amazing how much free time you think you have. And by free time, I mean wastable time.
Yeah. I mean, what Seneca says is, death finally presses, and we realize the life which we didn't notice passing has passed away. So I think just having that relationship to death is super important, and a great point. And did you have anything specific? Because I know my number one kind of relates to that, and so I could go into that right now.
Absolutely, please do.
So my number one here is my deathbed realization, and what do I actually want out of life. And it's exactly what you were saying, is that the practice that he talks about, is that, not that he talks about, the practice, the Stoic practice that came out of what I think out of what Seneca was saying, is that you view yourself on your deathbed. And so I viewed myself on my deathbed, and from that point I realized, what do I want to do with life. And so having that relationship to my own death has helped me kind of figure out life. And this was my number one because it kind of trickles down into everything else. And so thinking about myself dying, even though it sounds morbid, It truly helps because, okay, if you're on your deathbed and you look at your life and you say, okay, what did I do with my life? Did I spend 60 hours a week at work? Does that mean anything to me? So that was a question that I posed to myself. My current career, is this going to have a long lasting effect so that when I'm sitting on my deathbed, am I going to be happy with my career? Am I going to be happy that I spent 10 years doing XYZ?
Mhm.
So having that relationship with my death really almost created a purpose in my life.
Mhm.
And so that was super important to me.
Well, it's the thing that I took away, because it's interesting that the words that resonated with you were deathbed realization, and the reason I say that is I had the same reaction you had. The difference was what started to go through my brain was the phrase "moment of death," because for whatever reason in my brain, deathbed indicates that like everything's kind of cool. Like I've coasted to a life where I can die in a bed someplace. And I wanted to make sure that I was trying to force it into the concept that you really sometimes like you have a moment of seeing the car bearing down on you before it kills you. And that in that moment, I would always want to have a peaceful sense that I may not have accomplished everything I wanted to accomplish, but that I was actively engaged in trying to do that. And that there would be a peace that would come to me in that final moment, as opposed to, like, say, you're working at a job that you've hated, and you don't just hate it today, you've hated that job for 10 years. And then there's an earthquake and the building falls down around you. And that all you can think about is all the time that you wasted. So, so for me, just being able to tweak that idea a little bit from deathbed to moment of death, same idea, but that I really like, because I just know how arrogant I am about the idea of like how long I'm going to live a long time, and it's just silly. It's a because there's just so we live on a planet that's like actively trying to murder us at all times. Like the thunderstorms, earthquakes, fires. There's everything's just coming to get you. I mean, friggin' viruses that just reach out and try and murder you in your sleep. It's and strangely, we're very cocky about the idea of like, we'll just make it till we're 90. And I think that it's just helpful to keep the idea of moment of death being something that's real, and so that you can always be actively engaged in the things that you value.
Perfect. I love it. Now, what is your number one, Uncle Greg?
Well, my number one is sort of related to that, but it's that you have to have a value hierarchy, and that is, I think, in cultures or people who are highly religious, who use dogma, and the distinction between dogma and like a philosophy, for me, from my brain, is that a dogma is a set of life rules that is given to you, and then you either believe them or you disbelieve them. But a philosophy is something where you are sort of the person who has to actively come up with the life rules. And so, in this case of having a value hierarchy, it's the rules that you make for yourself, and not just a big bunch of rules, but rules that have to fall in a hierarchy. It's up to you to make a decision of what's the most important thing to you, and then make a decision about what's the second most important thing, the third most, the fourth most, all the way down to the 50th most, whatever. The point is, behind a hierarchy, it's you have to decide what wins when there's a conflict between one value and another.
I feel like in my life, the value hierarchy changes constantly. Is that normal?
It is absolutely the reality of life, and that's what because and that's the difference between a philosophy and a dogma. A dogma pretty much assumes that if you take this set of rules, you are good to go for the rest of your life. You'll never have to think about it again. Everything's cool. Just follow these 10 commandments and life is mellow. And it's but with the philosophy, with the idea of a value hierarchy, it is absolutely imperative that you be aware that your value hierarchy will shift. And a simple, gross example is that when I work, when I'm actually being employed by somebody else, I have a job hierarchy. There's a number one, there's a number two, there's a number three. And if I am for whatever reason don't have enough money, money is going to be the number one on that list until I've saved so much money that I no longer have to have that no longer needs to be my primary motivator. So money might slide down to number three or number four on the list. And then something like satisfaction with my work would slide into the number one slot. And that kind of thing it's your job, to your point, to realize that the only person who's going to monitor your value hierarchy is you. So you need to revisit it from time to time.
All right. I really like that. Like, do you have any recommendations on like how often would you reevaluate your hierarchy? Because I mean, like, could your hierarchy change on a daily basis? Or I mean, are these your value hierarchy is really like your basis of life and you have to edit it like over every few months or when it makes, I guess it would be really like when it makes sense. Like if you change something in your life or if your success criteria changes, right?
Right, exactly. But it's funny you brought that up and it really triggered something in me, which is this idea that creating a value hierarchy is a decision. And so a decision is very different from, in my mind, decisions are very different from choices. Like I might choose to watch Suicide Squad versus watching Justice League, but that's ephemeral and kind of dumb. Like we do that all day long. We make choices all the time. But a decision might be, I will always pay what I owe. And that is a bedrock thing that says there's a lot of benefit that I accrue from having relationship with the universe, where people see that I'm always good for what what any debts that I might have. I'm always good for them. And that is sort of set it and forget it, because so that thing that's on my value hierarchy, it's never going to change. So it's just a question of where it lives on the hierarchy. So shifting your hierarchy is primarily around the idea of I may have accomplished something. And so now that's no longer a big, like, so I made a decision, let's say, to write a novel. And that during that period, that was the most important thing to me, was to write that novel. But there will come a day when the novel's completed. So it's just off my list until another one comes along. So that's essentially it. Is realizing that to your question, if it changes every day, there's probably something wrong. There's probably what's on your hierarchy list are probably choices. They're probably sort of momentary things. But if they really are the bedrock things that mean the most to you, you'll kind of know when it's time to shift them, because you probably won't get rid of them. They'll just become less important.
Very good point. So those were our top fives. Did you have any other things to add there?
No, I think I'm just exhausted by the fact that we have gone through so many ideas in a relatively short period of time. But I'll tell you what, let's just take a quick break, and then we'll come back with our usual wrap up of your dad corner and my question or thought of the week. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, we'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and it's time for Josh's dad corner for the week, where he discusses a lesson or observation that popped up since the last time we recorded. So what's been happening, Josh?
Well, it's been a fun couple weeks with the kids. So one thing that kind of got me curious this week was thinking about managing my expectations of myself, as well as with my kids. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And so what I kind of wanted to get out of this, and I haven't fully figured it out. I mean, that's the point of philosophy and figuring this stuff out, is that it's just kind of a work in progress. Is that, for instance, when I first started becoming a parent, I was just reading everything and articles and really trying to be an awesome parent and make sure my kid is an amazing kid. And that was super important to me. Right. And so I'm like, all right, I need to do all these things to make sure my kid is great at speech and great at learning and nice and kind. And and so I had all these expectations of myself or of my kid that I think were just off base or off touch a little bit because
Uh-huh.
I wanted to try and make everything perfect.
Right.
And or you know, to the point of the readings, and so I created these expectations of myself and of my kids that I think were unrealistic.
Right.
And I don't think that these expectations were, it was just because, you know, well, if you do this, then you're going to be great at it. And you
Right.
know, if you read that, you're like, okay, I can do that. And then when it gets down to actually teaching your kid or teaching yourself, for any of this instance, it's just so hard to everyone's going to react differently.
Right.
So my point here is that if you expect everything from your kids, you know, you just got to try and they start falling short of your expectations,
Hmm.
then you need to realize that they're their own person. And this is what I've been realizing.
Yeah.
They're their own person. They learn at their own speed. They're gonna do their own thing. Once they get, I mean, my daughter's 4 years old now. I mean, she has a mind of her own. I mean, like when they're one, you know, they're not
Yeah.
talking much. I mean, they have a mind of their own for sure, but you know, they're not telling you anything.
Right.
My daughter has her set of expectations now. So I, as much as I teach her and I want her to learn more, I've really had to manage my expectations, of my kid and of myself, just to make sure I'm not anxious and just to make sure I stay happy. Because if my expectations of my kids are so high and they fall short, or if my expectations of myself are so high and I fall short, then what I was seeing is that I kept on getting into this like sad state almost,
Yeah,
where you
absolutely.
know I couldn't, yeah, if that makes sense. So I was just trying to focus on still keeping my goals and my expectations high, like not setting the bar too low,
Yeah.
but not setting the bar too high. So trying to find the middle ground.
Well, I think we actually covered something that's directly related to that, even though it may not seem like it. But part of this is that challenge of what do you control and what do you don't control, and being able to, because even the word expectations is a great example of a future state that you don't control. That if you put a lot of your energy and effort into the future state, you sort of miss what's happening in the here and now of the parts that you control. And it's and I know being a parent's got to be. I mean, I believe me, I'm just guessing. I don't have any direct insight into this, but that notion of trying to get out of the headspace of being an inventor, like you invented the child who, and they are an invention of yours that you can mold and create, versus the notion of being like a gardener, where you definitely give life to something and you know you're growing some corn, but you aren't exactly sure how the corn's gonna, like, you want it to taste good and you want it to be a certain size, but if it turns out to be a 6-inch cob of corn versus a 1-foot cob of corn, there's only so much of your energy that's going to be the thing that determines when that comes out. And so by being a good gardener, or a good parent in this case, that you really think about, like, what do you control? What are the things that you absolutely have 100% control of? And then do your best to try and get comfortable with that if you actually do all of the things that you control, that you get to that inner realization that the best you can do is the best you can do. Like, you can't be better than your best.
Yeah, those are all good points. And that's just something that I've really been trying to think about and really trying to figure out like the correct levels of expectations for myself. Like if I get upset at my children, and raise my voice, which I try and not do, but if that happens every once in a while, like does that make me a bad parent? You know, and if my expectations are I should not do that, then all of a sudden, so like it's almost talking about like success criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Like if my end goal is to not ever get upset with my kids, and I'm getting upset with my kids multiple times a week. Like, I just need to manage those expectations a little better.
Mhm.
Like my kids are gonna try and make me upset.
Oh
Like, and
yeah.
so so if they're making me upset, I'm gonna get upset, and that's just something that's gonna happen. And I have to realize that that's an okay thing to happen, and it's going to happen. And so that's just something I'm really thinking about and trying to get better at right now.
Right. And if nothing else, give yourself the permission to realize that you're on a journey. Momentary stimulus that might cause you like to get like this to get upset is very much like being stabbed in the arm with a pencil or something, where you're just going to react however you react. But it's the moment after that becomes really important, where and that's where you need to give yourself the flexibility and freedom to hold yourself to a high standard, but not internally hold yourself to a standard of perfection, because that's what'll drive you crazy. It's like, like no matter what happens, I'll never raise my voice. That is, if inside of you is a person who raises his voice, not even at your kid, I mean, just abstractly, like if if you kick the curb and you hurt your toe and you go, ah, then that means you're a person who might exclaim out loud when something happens. Then you just have to sort of really bring to bear that idea of like, look, it's okay for me to continuously strive to be my best. And that if I do come off of being the best, that's different than I wasn't perfect. Because like holding yourself to too high a standard drives you crazy. But you're right. If you hold yourself too low a standard, then you just, you put on your headphones and start drinking whiskey at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and tune out your reality altogether. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And I hope that we put this down as something where we can come back to this idea maybe in 5 or 6 months and just see how that journey on this particular idea works out.
Absolutely. So that was kind of my dad observation of the week. Uncle Greg, do you want to close us out here? Do you have a question or a thought of the week for us?
Yeah, I've got like Uncle Greg's big question for the week was something that I was given about 10 or 15 years ago, and it always stuck with me. And it was a question, and it's a question that goes, would you rather be successful or right? And you can substitute the word happy for successful or thinner for successful. Anything that is a terminal, like a state that you want to get into. And I think that the idea of being, just for what you just said, how about would you rather be a good parent or right, is a way of looking at this question, which is being right. There's two things that happen. People will either not be able to engage the question at all, meaning they'll say like, well, I want to be both. And that just shows that they aren't good at tackling these kind of questions that are intended to trigger thinking. Because sure, who wouldn't want to be both? Why did I just ask that question if the obvious answer is both? Then the next step is this idea of, well, what does it mean when I say I want to be happy or right? Like, why is that a choice I have to make? And the bottom line is that things change. And being right doesn't change. You're always right. But are you always happy? Or are you always a good parent? And that's when you need to be able to step back and go like, well, wait a second. The most important thing to me is to be successful. And in order for that to happen, and I have to get rid of the sense in me that I need to be right, that I need to look at the situation that's directly in front of me and realize that what I did yesterday that might have worked really well may not be the thing that works really well today. And that's the difference between people who prefer to be successful to being right, is that the person who wants to be successful will always encourage themselves to realize that yesterday's success has no bearing on today's success, and that you always have to engage in the principle of the thing that you want most. So if you want to be a good parent, you have to give up the idea that there's such a thing as being right about being a good parent, and realize that there's going to be a shifting scale of success at that thing over time. And I use the example of business all the time because it's perfect, which is let's say you came into the business to manufacture tires, and you became the most successful tire manufacturer ever. And the way that you became the most successful manufacturer of tires ever was that you created a lot of stores, and that you went about the process of making a tire and selling a tire at your store. But then all of a sudden, like, your numbers start to drop, and you aren't really quite sure why that's happening. But what's occurring outside of your successful universe is somebody else came up with the idea of, like, hey, wait a second, what if I could sell this online? And that'll be the path to success. You, as the guy running the successful tire company, may say to yourself, I have 40 years of unbroken success. I'm right about how to do this. I'm keeping my storefronts. That's the way you do this. I've got proof. I can prove to you that this is the best way to sell tires ever. And all while that's happening, that person doing the online selling is just going about their process until it's too late for you to change, because you were so convinced that you were right that you never adapted your business to the situation. So does that make sense?
It does make sense. And would you rather be successful or right? Just another great question for me to ponder and for our audience to ponder over the next few weeks.
Okay, that sounds great. And so when we come back, our next podcast is going to be a deeper dive into Seneca's On the Shortness of Life, where we're going to actually pull out the big ideas that are embedded inside the text itself and do a back and forth and discuss what are these specific ideas that Seneca has brought to us, and what they mean.
Sounds good to me. Looking forward to it.
Sounds great. Okay, Josh, well, have a great couple of weeks, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Great talking to you, Uncle Greg. Have a nice one.
Take care, pal. Hey folks, Uncle Greg here. Just wanted to thank you for listening, and be sure to join us next time when we break down the most important ideas in Seneca's On the Shortness of Life. And a special thanks to Ted Onulak and Exit 10 for our music. You can check them out at exit10band.com. That's EXIT10BAND.com.
Said it would be easy.